Yves Saint Laurent was one of the first designers to embrace and to fully accept black models on the runway. It can go back as early as 1962 when a model named Fidelia. It was a show that he put on before his major label debut, and her walking for that show, she became the first black model to walk on a high fashion runway. Big deal. He was also keen on consistently using black models, unlike his peers that would use black models for the moment or to appease people because tokenism is a thing. Using just a black model to, okay, we used one type thing. You also have to understand that fashion influences life, life influences fashion. So if you think of the 60s, during the time civil rights was a thing, Martin Luther King, there's a lot of conversation, discourse about equality. Equality wasn't a thing. And it was just starting to become a conversation. So black models were not commonly seen on runways at that time at all. For Laurent, it wasn't a political move. It was something that he saw as natural, as something that should always be, not because they were black, but because they were human. They were women just like everyone else, so why not use them? Contrary to popular belief, black women were buying luxury at the time. There were rich black folk back then. Fashion wasn't being pushed to them. Pierre Berger, longtime partner of Saint Laurent, said, he was very sensitive to the body of black women in their way of moving. He loved them. Looking back on the legacy of Saint Laurent in the house of Saint Laurent, a lot of women became muses of his. In the 70s, you had Munia, a Martinican model who was an announcer at a local airport and wasn't discovered until she transferred into a Paris airport. Before meeting Yves, she was already working in the industry. She worked for Givenchy. She was the first model to walk for Chanel. And he decided to take her on as his muse. I was Saint Laurent's first black muse. Sometimes I was his confidant, and I would sometimes inspire his creativity. He called me Moon Moon. That is so cute. The collection that made me a celebrity was the one inspired by Porgy and Bess. I wore a pink pantsuit and a boater hat. Catherine Deneuve stood up and started clapping. Then everyone stood up and called out, "Bravo!" Yves Saint Laurent peered around the curtain, a thing he had never done before, to see what all the commotion was about. The people were shouting, "Bravo, Yves Saint Laurent!" and "Brava, Munia!" He took me in his arms and we kissed. This for me was history. When you look back at Munia's legacy, you notice that Yves was part of all of it. And her success paved the way for so many black models that came after her, including Naomi Campbell. In 1988, Naomi Campbell became the first black woman on the cover of French Vogue. And that alone opened the door for Naomi in so many ways. Yves was part of this as well. We think of Naomi as this pinnacle of fashion success and everything. But Naomi also faced racism in her career. "They won't give me a cover," she cried to Saint Laurent. He replied to her, No, not even a question." So he pulls all of Saint Laurent's advertising from French Vogue, and magically she gets a cover. Speaking of magazines, it's also important to note that Saint Laurent put his advertising in Ebony magazine, which wasn't a normal thing to do back then. High fashion designers didn't put their advertising in black publications. It's like color me shocked but never surprised that there's so much history that goes behind blackness in the fashion industry. Back on topic though, so when you look back at how important it was to him to make sure that his castings were diverse, like you had Rebecca Ayoko from Togo, Sonia Cole, which was a British black model, the Somalian Iman, the Brazilian Dalma Callado. There were so many of them. Naomi, there were so many of them that he chose to use. Alek Wek, everybody. A lot of the creative directors that succeeded him erased a lot of his diversity work. But it's also in line with the 2000s where the whiteout was a thing. So models became very European, Eastern European, because the Eastern European countries opened up at the time. They started scouting there. So the erasure of black models happened in the Y2K era. But then you can fast forward to Anthony Vaccarello, who is the current creative director at Saint Laurent. And he is responsible for launching the career of Adu Dekesh, another parallel to Saint Laurent. The fall 2022 collection saw a casting that was very reminiscent of what Saint Laurent would do himself. There were so many African beauties, black beauty in that show. And it also launched the career of Alado Jasper. When you look back at that show, it felt like a love letter. The setting, it felt like a glamorous 1980s department store. The fashion was very 80s. And watching that show, 60 years later, his dedication felt like new.